Hey. Woo! Yeah, you know, these are some old ones, really. They're mostly poems about people dying. This first one's called Ode to Burns. There's a fire burning and Mingus is on the box. And as so often happens when Mingus is on the box, I'm thinking of D. Boone. The music of Mingus and the soul of Mingus and the volume of air displaced by Mingus rarely fail to bring that other great American into my mind. The vision of Mingus on the eve of eviction firing his shotgun into the ceiling of his loft with a grin of surprised delight reminds me of a show at the T-Bird Roller Dome in Fullerton. The stage that night was a two-high pile of risers stacked in a way that was none too stable. When the superheroines played, you didn't really notice how wobbly it was. But when the Minutemen played, they'd move around quite a bit. And every time D. Boone shouted "motherfucker" into the mic, he'd jump into the air. And when he landed, those risers shook like crazy. D. Boone shouted "motherfucker" a lot, so the stage shook a lot. And every time it shook, D. Boone got the same little grin Mingus got when he emptied his shotgun into the air. And the music of Mingus, as the music of D. Boone, blasts through the dark reaches of the universal nothing, setting ablaze brains that have been so long seized by cold they have become their own engines of nada. For the collective sake of whatever is left, let us hope the future of this world is never one in which the match that is Mingus and the match that is D. Boone has been lost to our brains or to our souls forever. This one's called Threnody for John Easley, Jim Shepard, Glenn Spearman, Dick Higgins, and Ray Bremser. John Easley was the singer of a Boston punk band called Sorry. Jim Shepard was a musician from Ohio. His most famous bands probably were Vertical Slit and V3. Glenn Spearman was a tenor player from the West Coast. Dick Higgins was a Fluxus guy and a publisher and general artist in New York. Ray Bremser was a professional criminal and a poet. It would be disingenuous to say that all my friends are dying or to suggest that everyone I know who's dying was my friend. But this fall, 1998, a year or 2 years before the millennium, the cold wind that usually sweeps my spirits up every year at this time of year seems to be blowing so fucking hard that people are flying right off the goddamn planet. I don't know. In general, when the leaves come off the trees and the color comes off the hills, my sense is we're getting a chance to see things as they really are. To see the bones of the planet without the stuff usually dolling it up, and that feels good. But this year, the grayness of the rocks and the rocky grayness of the cloud sheets hanging and shifting over the top of my valley seem to imply a blandness of spirit creeping up on us, trying to offer us a future infinitely duller than the future we'd imagined. John Easley was what, maybe 30 or so. I hadn't seen him in years, but my memory of his massive bulk flung sideways through the air while he blatted punk lyrics in front of a bunch of Harvard kids is pretty fresh. Now he's gone with a bang, and my connection with that whole scene feels far more tenuous than I could have ever imagined. Jim Shepard was my age and a little, mid-40s or something, I guess, and he could be a difficult guy, but he was also one of the era's great inventors. His musical vision so personal and so homemade. He'd already overcome so many problems, it always seemed like he had the stuff. That he'd figured out the alchemy of turning his problems into art, the only thing that'll save any of us. So you've got to wonder where this leaves a lot of people who weren't Jim's equal. Glenn Spearman was 51 and Jesus had been sick for so long, you almost started to think that he was right. Maybe he wasn't sick. But I guess he knew it was the end not long after he was back east that last time. I guess he was right. And on one hand, I'm glad he died the way he did, in bed and not in some goddamn punk alley in Oakland. But man, I wish I could hear him play one more time. Because he was, for me, more than anyone else I've known, a connection straight to the heart of original jazz freedom. Dick Higgins was 60 or so, and I only saw him do a performance once in New York a long time ago. And I never met him, except through letters I wrote him a couple of times, because when I did see him at parties in the city a few other times, I was really just a kid. He seemed pretty weird and imposing, the way 40-year-olds do when you're 20 and drunk, and in a place you're not really supposed to be, or at least since you're 20, you don't think you're supposed to be there. But there are aspects of Higgins' thinking that have colored my way of doing things more than any real teacher. The thought that there will be no more of his new projects on the horizon makes me feel kind of lightheaded. Ray Bremser was in his 60s too, although he looked like he was a million. And goddamn, I guess he was sicker and shit when we saw him in Cherry Valley. But you wouldn't have known it. He really had his wily geezer act down. Sure as hell seemed that like more than half his barrels were firing, since he honestly gave us as good a raft of shit as you'd get from someone half his age who was feeling every one of his oats, which he wasn't. But Weinberg says when he last saw Ray in the hospital about 2 hours before he died, Ray was asking to hear some Coltrane, which would make for a pretty good passage. So I guess he had his act together till the end. I can only hope that John and Jim and Glenn and Dick had something approaching the beautiful transportational power of Coltrane's visions blowing through their heads before the wind washed over them that last time. Sometimes self-righteous turds like to say something good comes from death, that there are lessons taught, that there are dreams passed on, that there is a natural rhythm to existence which predicates a certain number of snuffs. All this may be so. And all these guys fucked death in the ass enough times. Perhaps they could no longer confound it by the constant motion of their brains and their souls and their bodies. But there are no lessons to be learned from their deaths. There is only a sense that there are now 5 fewer backs to push against the envelope and help us keep the great gray mass from becoming a permanent condition. A heavy, static haze, slowly binding the efforts of everyone who's still around, fighting off entropic gush in big ways or small. It would be wrong to say these heroes have not left vestiges, but what can we do except burn their bodies, scatter their ashes, and hope that we or someone can keep building castles of resistance on a mound of dead fighters that grows slowly higher every year. I'd like to think the clouds I see this fall are the smoke of Kathy Acker and William Burroughs and Herbert Huncke and Allen Ginsberg and Jack Micheline and Dennis Charles and Robert Palmer and everyone else whose death has preceded my own, but I don't think it's so, and that more than sucks. Maybe next year when the trees go bare and my world turns into a granite quarry overnight, I'll be able to see it with fresh eyes. But this fall, this motherfucking mountain of a fall 1998, I ain't into it. And I may never be into it quite the same way again. This one's called A Hymn of Scent. John Fahey, the great iconoclaster bound too tight by the universe just as he once was by clothes and even by skin, all designed to be worn by a mere mortal, which he was not, has left his meat empty and untended, but not forgotten and not unloved. For in the memories and the future trajectories of 1,000 nights and of 1,000 trips and of 1,000 glides through the ether, his haunting presence, if not quite as big as life, nor quite as smelly as life, still twirls long fingers like dark crystals refracting endlessly through the royal of eternity. And he gave so much of himself and of his essential whatsis that the stain he left on our planet, which was merely another sofa to him, will never be fully erased, no matter how hard they scrub. This is called a 1-2. On checking my email today, tax day, the day on which our participation demonstrates once and for all that we believe ourselves to be citizens of the United States, I have discovered that not one but 2 men whose work made this life the most bearable form of all known forms of life have had their spirits wiped from the planet without a whole lot of fanfare. On the face of it, there would seem to be little connecting Sandy Bull and Joey Ramone, but having stood in the same room, conversing with both of them, albeit on separate occasions, it's possible for me to make a few rough generalizations about their commonalities. Both were tall, both were thin, both were generous with themselves and with their fame, or at least from my observations, with the road towards it and the road away from it. And certainly in my life, both had important places. The first time I played pinball with Joey at CB's in 1976 was assuredly the first time I really understood the possibility that my physical skin sac and non-physical thought sac might be connected to any kind of culture more widely dispersed than the people in my immediate social circle. A revelation responsible for kicking me in the direction of whole new forms of poverty and ecstasy. And even though Sandy affected me through his music more than through his physical presence, which was quite ghostly by the time we connected in flesh. There's no denying the fact that the splendor of his lateral runs on E pluribus unum cut deep furrows into my brain during those months I was first experimenting seriously with acid. Months which, in retrospect, were as influential as any I have ever lived. And I guess they're both still with us, Joey and Sandy, in one sense anyway, because you or I or anybody can reach out and grab one of their records and put it on the box and bring them as close as either ever got to actually visiting most of our houses while they were still alive. But it's not really the same, because I know in an elemental way I will never play another game of pinball with Joey Ramone, as though I'd actually been to CB's in years. And I know I will never fly down to Nashville and sit with Sandy Bull and hear his story the way I felt it should have been heard, as though I could ever find an editor who cared. And these facts chip away at my sense of well-being and of my sense that there's something right in this world. In the deepest way, it is ever more apparent that important parts of my culture, the culture of the underground, are being washed away and are not being replaced by anything as truly world-beating as that which we've lost. And where does this really leave any of us when we want to unplug from the world as it is presented to us? Now that I'm looking at my taxes, I'm starting to wonder why the fuck there aren't numbered lines and empty spaces where I can indicate that I, taxpayer, have given $1,000 to Joey Ramone so he could record some crazy duets with Ronnie Spector, really get that shit happening, or that I, citizen, have given some money to Sandy Bull to help him release those archival tapes he was always talking about, get them unspooling into the ears of my fellow countrymen who are dealt such a handful of turd in the guise of culture. They do not know and could not guess what precious things have just been removed from their presence forever. Can we really be as oblivious as we seem and continue to exist as a country in which people actually live? When you think we are paying money to keep that fat scumbag Cheney's heart from popping like a grape, and to have Strom Thurmond's colon scraped for bugs, it is really going to make you wonder what the hell we are doing and why on earth, on this earth, we are still bothering to do it. And then a last one, I wrote a Tonka for Adam. Adam Nodelman, so many things left undone, such havoc unwreaked, a force field now left empty, silent as a hollow stone. That's it.